Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Mandy Sally. I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at the Woodhull Freedom Foundation, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to our April Censorship Series program. I have three brilliant, amazing panelists joining me this month, as I do every month, and we're going to get into some current events and talking about free speech and our current presidential administration and the First Amendment and all that good stuff. And so we have lots of ground to cover. But before I get into my questions, just a few sort of housekeeping things. One, this is recorded and this will be on Woodhull's YouTube page so that you can share it with your friends and family after you learn all of this fabulous information. It also means if you can't stay with us the whole time, that is A-OK. The recording will be available to you. I will also be sending a follow-up email with all of the links and resources that our panelists mentioned today, so you can just totally tune in and pay attention. Don't have to worry about furiously jotting anything down. And the last thing I'll say is we would love to hear your comments and your reactions during our conversation today. So please feel free to drop any comments in the Zoom chat. Also, please introduce yourself. Would love to know who's joining us and where they're joining us from today. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce my panelists for today, and we're going to get into it. First up, we have Hadar Harris. She is the managing director in Washington at PEN America. She's also an award-winning international human rights attorney who's worked for more than 2 decades on a broad range of human rights issues in more than 25 countries. Thanks for joining us, Hadar.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And next up, we have Professor Dara Purvis. Professor Purvis is a scholar of family law, sexual orientation and gender identity, feminist legal theory, and masculinities at Temple University's Beasley School of Law. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Of course, it's my pleasure.
Yeah. And last but certainly not least, we have Adam Steinbaugh. Adam is an attorney and member of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, or FIRE, as it's more widely known. He's a member of their litigation team and also a member of the First Amendment Lawyers Association. Thanks for joining us, Adam.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So, let's just jump right into it. Since January 20th, President Trump has issued over 100 executive orders. One of those orders pertains to free speech, and I think that's where we should start our conversation today. I'm wondering if we could break down what that order says and, maybe sort of reason what it might be trying to accomplish. And Adam, I'm going to start with you.
Sure. So reading the text of the order, it essentially says free speech is important. I think that's something that we can all agree on. I think it's something that most Americans agree on. I think that if you surveyed Americans, you'd find that they love free speech and the American flag and apple pie and all of that. Embracing free speech in the abstract is something that rarely loses votes. It's very popular to do. And if you look at the text of the order, it starts out by saying that essentially faulting the Biden administration and saying, under the guise of combating misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, the federal government infringed on the constitutionally protected free speech rights of American citizens across the United States in a manner that advanced the government's preferred narrative about significant matters of public debate. And this is referencing the debate we've seen over the past couple of years about the federal government's pressure largely on social media companies to limit debate about COVID and other issues that have popped up over the last couple of years. So that's sort of the introduction of the policy or the executive order itself. And in terms of its operative terms, it says that the policy of the federal government is to protect free speech, and that the federal government may not use federal resources to restrict free speech. And that's something that the First Amendment already does. That already sets forth the policy of the federal government, all three branches, to protect freedom of speech. So it's not really saying a whole lot more that the First Amendment has not already said. The executive order could have just said, see the First Amendment, we're just going to keep doing that. The second part that it does is it says that the Attorney General is obligated to investigate past actions contrary to the order and contrary to freedom of speech, but only look at the last 4 years. Do not look behind door number 2. So it's pretty nakedly political. It's not sort of a clean hands look back at what the federal government has done in the past to limit free speech. It's just looking at the last administration and trying to find examples of the suppression of free speech there. So don't look at the first Trump administration, just look at Biden. And that's to be a little bit cynical here, that's pretty performative. They are getting the benefit of loudly embracing freedom of expression without the obligation to defend free speech when it is unpopular to do so. And I think that to a certain extent, it is good to have government officials and governments reasserting or asserting and reaffirming our values, including freedom of expression. It's important that they do that because that helps reinforce freedom of expression as a cultural issue. But when you then turn around and limit free speech, I think it would have been better to have remained silent about your supposed commitment to freedom of expression in the first place, because now you're undermining it both as a legal matter and as a cultural matter. Because if you are limiting freedom of expression while loudly proclaiming that you embrace it, it's going to leave a lot of people thinking that maybe freedom of expression is not something that our government actually believes in. It's not something folks on the other side of the political aisle actually believe in. So I hope that's sort of a setting the table here.
Can I just add?
Yes,
we're going to jump in and have a discussion, right? There's another piece of that first executive order. This was one of the very first executive orders that actually was issued on January 20th. So, it has the language, and it's called Restoring Free Speech and Ending Federal Censorship. And you see in a lot of these executive orders, there's this very sweeping language that seems to make this commitment. But as Adam said, it's limited, or it actually doesn't do what it says it's going to do. There's a second part of that executive order which talks about mis and disinformation. And similar to what Adam just said, it talks about under the guise of combating misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, the federal government infringed on the constitutionally protected speech rights of American citizens across the U.S. in a manner that advanced the government's preferred narrative about significant matters of public debate. Government censorship of speech is intolerable in a free society. We agree with that line. Government censorship of speech is intolerable in a free society. I think we can all agree on that. But the ways in which mis and disinformation has been kind of attempted to be dealt with by the government is a sensitive issue, is a difficult issue, is a complicated issue. And in the context of this executive order, it sort of opens the door to shutting down research or any work around ending mis and disinformation, certainly any funding that is done by the government to do that, and opens the door to a whole lot more mis and disinformation. So it's pretty concerning from that point of view.
Yeah, appreciate that perspective. And before I move to our next question, Dara, anything you want to add?
Sure. Actually, it's Dara.
So sorry. Thank you, Dara.
The only thing I will add is I think that this is characteristic of the Trump administration in that it purports to vindicate rights that should be held by all Americans. But when you look at what they're actually focusing on, it is only one group of people who agree with Trump's ideological goals, whose rights are actually being protected. And that same right that is supposedly being vindicated is very directly being limited if you disagree with the Trump administration and its broader political goals. So it's a very cynical, hypocritical in a lot of ways use of constitutional rights.
Yeah, and our theme of our discussion today is this idea that the First Amendment is being used to curtail exactly what you said, Dara, the rights of others. And here at Woodhull, we're always talking about sexual freedom and folks with identities that fall outside the quote unquote norm or regular binary, whatever you want to call it. And we've sort of seen these executive orders, as there's been a lot of them, start to tackle that topic as well, and limit speech. But beyond just the executive order, I wonder if we could talk a little bit about some of the actions that have followed this particular executive order and whether those support or undermine these principles we've been talking about. So I'm going to kick it to you to take that question, Hadar.
Well, so I might both broaden and narrow your question a little bit and say, we're at day 80 today as we're recording this. And it feels like 800 years, not days, in terms of the speed, breadth, and depth of what has happened over this time. There have been more than 100 executive orders. And then in addition to those orders, there have been different guidances and directives that have come out through government agencies that have impacted a wide swath of people or websites or higher education or K through 12 institutions, nonprofit organizations, foundations, and lawyers and the judicial system. Take your pick. It's been very sweeping. But I would suggest that almost all of the executive orders that have come out in terms of those that touch on those areas really do implicate free speech. And they do implicate it in a variety of different ways. I'll offer kind of 5 buckets of the ways that they do that. First, as we were talking a little bit about the trivialization of words and concepts and laws. A lot of the names of these executive orders purport to do one thing and they do kind of the opposite. It's kind of like living in the upside down or living in opposite land. So you see this great, ending radical indoctrination, and then you read it and it's like, oh, this is actually about creating indoctrination in K through 12 schools. Oh, we're ending radical gender ideology. I'm all about ending radical gender ideology, except actually what it's doing is to strip and create really kind of hateful rhetoric around particular groups of people. And I know we're going to talk about that a little bit more as we move forward. So, and then the third example I would give is ending illegal DEI, which nobody really quite understands and knows what that means. But saying that illegal discrimination is in and of itself a civil rights violation, when what they're actually purporting to do is to say that anything that really opens the pool and tries to end discrimination in and of itself is illegal, twists around the words, twists around the concepts, and even twists around the laws. And we can talk about that later. The second bucket is around cultural capture and ideological conformity. And we see that in a lot of ways. We see that in the capture of the Kennedy Center, when the president said that he was going to take over the board and become the chair of the Kennedy Center and got rid of a bunch of people. You see it in the attacks on press freedom. You see it in the cultural realm where there are these certification requirements that are starting to emerge that are demanding that anybody that receives federal funds in a variety of different spaces are required to certify that they adhere to all of these executive orders, including the ones about radical gender ideology, which is a hateful anti-trans executive order. And that by certifying that you are complying, you are not only complying for the grant that you might be applying for or the contract that you're up for, but that all of the work of your organization complies with it. That is extremely chilling, and that is extremely difficult around, to ensure that there is freedom of thought, freedom of expression, freedom of artistic ability, and freedom in so many different ways. So, one other piece as we talk about the capture, the kind of ideological capture, is the banning of words and concepts. So not only do you have to certify that you're complying with a bunch of things, but the government recently has started to ban certain words and concepts in grant proposals or government funded research or has been stripping resources off of government websites that include words not just like gay or sexual orientation, but female and woman and discrimination and underrepresented. And PEN America has actually tracked more than 250 words that we've identified so far. So we can talk about that more a little bit later, but it's really important to understand that the actions, not just the orders, are kind of reinforcing that idea. I'll just go really quickly. The third bucket is attacks on education. That's both K through 12 and higher ed. The targeting of NGOs and civil society, and then just a really fundamental undermining of the rule of law overall. So it's been broad, it's been sweeping, it's been deep, and it touches freedom of expression in a variety of different ways. And it absolutely touches on and goes straight for sexual freedom and the themes that we're talking about here today.
Yeah, absolutely. Appreciate you breaking that all down. I feel like those 5 buckets you named probably could like make up their own censorship series program.
Sure.
I appreciate the sort of brief but really helpful way you outlined all of that. Adam or Dara, anything you want to add?
I think she covered it actually very well. I also like the organization because I think it gives a picture of the scope, which is really staggering.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think it helps to just organize so much of what's been overwhelming. And you spoke to this, Dar, about these 80 days, which when you said that, I was like, oh my gosh, it's only been 80 days. Is that there's just so much information and so much happening on such a wide scale that it is hard to make sense of all of it. And so I think talking about the First Amendment, talking about free speech gives us a narrower sort of way to explore a lot of what is happening. And I appreciate that. So, Dara, actually, my next question is for you, and it's sort of a constitutional civics question, but one of the difficulties I think for a lot of people in understanding these executive orders relates to one, the volume, which I just talked about, and the speed that they're being released. But I also wonder, like, what sort of actual power do these executive orders have over our government and over, us as citizens? Could you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. Executive orders at root are kind of just a directive to the executive branch. So the idea is this is not a new law. This is not a court interpretation of a law. It is the head of the executive branch telling the agencies and bureaucracy below them, here is how we want you to implement our policies. Here is how we want you to execute these laws. So in theory, this sounds limited in the sense that it's not overruling any actual laws that have been passed through Congress and signed by a president. It, in theory, is not changing interpretation of laws where the Supreme Court has issued a ruling saying, here is how this is to be implemented. I will note that Trump's executive orders are beginning to encroach on those areas. For example, they very directly target a pretty recent ruling from the Supreme Court, Bostock v. Clayton County, that held that Title VII that prohibits discrimination in employment. The import of the case is this protects LGBTQ people. And several of the executive orders say, oh, I'm directing the attorney general or heads of agencies to clarify or to narrow how Bostock should be applied. But because of the size of the federal bureaucracy, lots of agencies that do really important things, this can have a huge impact. And it's in a lot of ways that people interact with directly in their daily life, even if they don't think of it as here is a place that I am interacting with the federal government, it has a big impact. And historically, executive orders have been behind some of the most dramatic actions that affect the daily lives of Americans. The Emancipation Proclamation from Lincoln was an executive order. The internment camps that put Japanese Americans in literal physical camps during World War II was accomplished through executive orders. And a lot of our daily contacts, the things that we go about in our daily lives, sending our kids to school, is at root really affected by the Department of Education. The Department of Justice is taking all sorts of actions or choosing not to take actions that vindicate all of our rights or don't vindicate all of our rights. So it is just the executive and the executive branch, but that really touches people's lives in ways that I think they are not always at the forefront of their awareness.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Always good to get a little mini history lesson in there as well. So thank you for that explanation. And, as someone who is not a lawyer, but obviously very invested in what's going on in our country, a lot of these executive orders related to gender and sexual expression seem too broad and too narrow in a lot of ways, to borrow your term, Hadar. And there's a specific one that I want to dive into, and I'm just going to read it because it has a very long name, but it's called Defending Women from Gender Ideology, Extremism, and Restoring Biological Truth to the Federal Government. So, here we see it attempts to define terms like gender ideology, gender identity. And, I think we're seeing examples of how this is impacting, particularly folks who are trans or non binary. But I'm wondering if we could speak to a little bit more specifically how this will impact folks who identify outside of that binary. Hadar alluded to this earlier, so I'm going to kick this to you first.
Mm-hmm. I mean, this is just I would recommend, well, it's like you have to put a trigger warning on reading this executive order, because truly the language within it seeks to negate the identity of anybody that, as the order said, is not one of two sexes. There are only two biological sexes, and the idea of gender as something that's on a spectrum or something that is outside of male and female doesn't exist. Full stop. And it goes into pretty significant length to reinforce this idea and to create kind of a framework within which to erase the identities of a large swath of people within this country and around the world. And this executive order has actually been pointed to in other executive orders as kind of the framing through which curricula should be changed, through which people shouldn't be given jobs, through which people need to be ousted from the military. So it's very damaging and very dangerous. And like Dara said, the executive orders in some ways are limited. And many of these executive orders, and it's really important to note that, first of all, the sheer number of executive orders that have been issued so far is way beyond any other administration, including the first administration, in the history of executive orders. And executive orders reach back to George Washington, to their first president. But the often in many of these executive orders, they are overbroad. They are purposely vague. They are certainly grounds for litigation. And there is litigation pending on a variety of these, including this one, and its implementation. So, to speak to non-lawyers, to know that fundamentally what this executive order does is to say that there's no such thing as anything beyond male and female, anything beyond, biological sex, and the idea of gender is not acceptable, right? And, I'm not going to read through all of the language, but, I would say that some of these executive orders are also kind of careless. So the way that it defines female is that Female means a person belonging at conception to the sex that produces the large reproductive cell. Lots of people have ridiculed that because, first of all, sex isn't determined at conception, number one. And number two, what is the large reproductive cell? As you know, I mean, I remember high school biology. I think it has to do with chromosomes and it has to do with X's and Y's, right? But that's not the way that it's defined here. So you want to, lawyers, you want to poke holes in this? Let's start right there, right? That none of this is exactly right. But then again, we go back to the disinformation stuff, and I don't know. So, but it's a very damaging kind of ground setting of how the administration sees and understands sex and gender, the space of non-binary and trans people, and it very directly attacks their identity and lays the groundwork for their erasure in a pretty devastating way.
Absolutely. It's blatant and awful. And I appreciate the trigger warning. I do think it's important for folks to read these things to know what's happening. But yeah, if you should read it with care, I would say. And I will link to the executive orders we're discussing in the chat, as well as the follow-up email, so folks can read them. But, Adam, I have a follow-up question related to this. And are there any existing free speech or free expression protections related to gender expression? Can you speak to that a little bit from your perspective? Fire.
Well, I would start with the notion that the Supreme Court has said under the First Amendment there is no such thing as a false idea. So no president gets to say, here is the biological truth about sex and gender. That's not something that the president gets to decide. The First Amendment leaves that to individual people to decide and come to their own conclusions. And one of the problematic things about this executive order is that it could be interpreted to reach a lot of disagreement among people on these contested issues. And the president of the United States does not get to come to a conclusion one way or another about what the truth is about these issues. So you have, one of the things that we've been watching out for is the extent to which this executive order will limit speech, particularly in higher education, where people disagree about these issues, about these ideas, and to the extent that the government is trying to leverage the vast amount of money and finances and resources that it contributes to education to say, because we contribute this money to your education, now we get to decide what the truth is and what you will learn specifically in your education. That undermines the very purpose of a university, which is to explore differing ideas. And if you have someone at the top of our government saying, here is the truth, here is the correct idea, that inverts the very purpose of a university. And we saw that we have a case that is currently pending in Texas, in which the Texas A&M University system banned student drag shows, pointing to this executive order and saying, well, because of this executive order, we fear that the university will lose its funding, or that its funding will be threatened if we allow students to host this drag show. Never mind that the students have been hosting the drag show there for 5 or 6 years without a single complaint. This, and never mind that the executive order doesn't actually say anything about drag shows and nothing about universities at all. You had a university system taking advantage of this to accomplish censorship that they wanted to implement, and using the executive order almost as an excuse to do so. In that case, we were able to bring a First Amendment challenge to the ban, and the judge in that case, who is a George H.W. Bush appointee, who, I'm going to guess, probably does not go to drag shows on her free time on the weekends, very quickly looked at this case, looked at the ban, and found it very obvious that the executive order didn't apply, and that this was an egregious example of censorship. And she held that we were likely to succeed in that case. And as a result of that, the students were able to perform the drag show. And once again, nobody complained, because if you don't want to go see a drag show, the really easy way to do that is to not buy a ticket. So, from that, the First Amendment does protect people's rights to present ideas or to perform. And it is important that they stand up for their own rights, because when you stand up for your own rights, you protect the rights of others as well.
So I really appreciate, first of all, we appreciate the case that Fires brought, because it's really important. And there are so many cases that are coming very quickly, because what we're seeing is this sort of reaction and overreaction in a variety of different spaces, universities being one of them, but not only, to this directive. Look, the executive order is also pretty specific about what it directs various people within the executive branch to do, agencies and federal employees. And among the things that they are directed to do is to strip language on government websites, and to change the meaning of words on government websites to comply with this order. So let me read you part. It says, each agency and all federal employees shall enforce laws governing sex-based rights, protections, opportunities, and accommodations to protect men and women as biologically distinct sexes. So that means that they're interpreting it, and they're telling all of the agencies to apply this definition that's within the executive order to everything that they do. And it goes on to say each agency should therefore give the terms sex, male, female, men, women, boys, and girls the meanings set forth in Section 2 of this order when interpreting or applying statutes, regulations, or guidance, and in all other official agency business documents and communications. That's very sweeping. That is a broad directive to the entire executive branch, all federal employees, all agencies, to redefine and to reinterpret and to apply this truth, as Adam said, and I'm going to put that in quotes, this viewpoint, this very specific viewpoint that President Trump has outlined in this order, into play in the way that the government does its work. That then goes on, the executive order then goes on to specify other specific places, like directing the Secretary of State to ensure that that there is only male or female as choices on passports. As we know, in the last years, people have been able to choose X as their gender identity, and that has now been stripped. And there's been a great deal of discussion. My friend and former colleague Darren Rosenblum wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, I think, about what it meant to Darren to have to now, when they reapply for a passport, to potentially not have X as their gender identity. And it's very meaningful to a variety of different people. So I think that, understanding the breadth and, of this order and the specificity within it, the order to strip language from the website, to reinterpret and reapply it, and to change the ways in which we understand through court interpretations, through congressional legislative histories, the way that we understand gender and sex is pretty profound.
Yeah, and Dara, I'd love to hear from you on this as well.
Sure. One dimension of the passport and identity documents that I briefly want to flag is there are other actions, not necessarily relating to the executive orders, but that will hinge on those. So the SAVE Act, as the time we're taping this, passed the House this morning, and it would require different documents to be able to vote, and that those documents reflect someone's sex assigned at birth. So if the SAVE Act were to pass, because of the changes to identity documents available, this would mean that trans and non-binary people, if they have reflected their gender identity on official documents, could not vote, which is about as extreme discrimination as I can think of. But I also wanted to add, Adam was talking earlier about the importance of gender performances, and to sound like a gender studies professor for a moment, all of our gender expression is us performing our gender through things like clothing, hairstyle, aesthetic choices. And that has been specifically recognized by a variety of courts as free speech that is protected by the First Amendment. So I've written about this specifically in the context of children in schools as part of their free speech rights. But it's been recognized in a variety of circumstances, both specifically a case where a trans girl at school was being told that she couldn't wear feminine coded clothing. And a court said that violates her free speech rights. These are ways that she is expressing her gender. And it's also come up in reference to other symbolic speech claims where someone is wearing something or making style choices that they say they want to reflect a specific message. And a number of courts, in the context of evaluating, is this symbolic speech? You have to show I have a specific message, and the people who see me are likely to recognize that message. Courts in a number of circumstances have said, well, people wouldn't understand this message. It wouldn't be really clear. For example, a trans woman wearing a skirt or a dress, that's very clearly symbolic speech expressing the fact that she is a woman. So courts have, in a variety of circumstances, specifically said our presentation of our gender is speech and is protected by the First Amendment.
Thanks, Sarah. I appreciate that. And I will say your gender studies professor hat and viewpoint is always welcome here at the Woodhull Freedom Foundation Censorship Series. So I appreciate that. And I want to ask a follow-up question about court rulings. And I wonder if you could say anything about any maybe prior court hearings we should be looking at for maybe some guidance, or if folks out there maybe are feeling inspired to fight back in some way or write a legislator, could you point us in the direction of maybe some cases we should take a look at, or some decisions that might offer some guidance in this moment?
I think the question of inspiration and guidance are kind of different at the moment, because the current Supreme Court is so different than Supreme Courts of the past. So when I am looking to give students inspiration of kind of high watermarks of protection of free speech, Tinker versus the United States was kids protesting the Vietnam War wearing black armbands. And it's a case where the Supreme Court kind of created one of the default standards for evaluating the speech of students, specifically K through 12 students. But I think of it as a real high watermark for student speech rights, because the court said, unless you are invading the rights of other students or causing a material disruption to the educational activities of the school, students still hold these rights. There are examples of arguably offensive speech or arguably sexualized speech being protected. A lot of these came out of the court during the Vietnam War. So a case called Cohen involved someone with expletives on a jacket sitting in a courtroom. That the court said that is still speech. This is protected even if people disagree with it. Now, do I think that these cases are guidance in terms of giving us an idea of what will happen tomorrow or next term before the Supreme Court? I am less positive on that. I worry particularly that there's a real push towards even older understandings of speech around sexual topics writ large that would treat them as obscene and as unprotected by the First Amendment. But if you want hope, Google the caseload of fire and see what all the advocacy organizations, the challenges they're bringing to these actions, and support their work.
Yeah, well, thanks for that segue, Dara, because my next question was going to be to Adam and to ask if you could speak to some of the key legal challenges or lawsuits that have been filed in response to, some of these executive orders and actions, because I know there's been a lot happening in the courts. And again, that could probably be its own program. But if you could just give us some of the highlights, I would appreciate that.
It's almost too difficult to survey the highlights quite yet because the justice system, the legal system moves very, very slowly, especially in comparison to how quickly this administration has acted. So again, we're on day 80 here, I think. And there have been more executive orders than there have been days in the administration. And there are probably quite a few more challenges on top of that. One that I would look to is the decision that came down, I believe, yesterday in Washington, D.C., in which a Trump appointee said that the White House had violated the First Amendment by excluding the Associated Press from particular access to the Oval Office, to spaces beyond the press room in the White House, on the basis that the Associated Press had said, under our policies, we still call it the Gulf of Mexico. It's not the Gulf of America, because that is not, the president can't just dictate the name of a international body of water. And the White House took that as an affront to the president's apparent authority or claimed authority, and excluded them on that basis. And I went and watched the hearing on the temporary restraining order in that case. If you ever have a chance to go and watch one of these sort of high-profile cases, take the opportunity. It's a moment to be able to watch at least history. And the judge there wound up not granting the temporary restraining order, which is for sort of the first emergency stage of relief. And I disagreed with him as to his reasoning in not doing so. But from the hearing, it was apparent that he was giving a very fair consideration to both parties. And just yesterday, he ruled in favor of the Associated Press and said that the White House was barring them to spaces that are otherwise open to other press outlets on the basis of their viewpoint. And that's just sort of the third rail of the First Amendment. The government can't discriminate on the basis of viewpoint. So that's one of the cases that is out there. But I think it is still too early to be able to pick the ones that are going to go to the Supreme Court or even be important on appeal. But I think it is very important that a lot of organizations out there are bringing these challenges, bringing them very quickly, and standing up for those rights. So even if you are, like me, sort of overwhelmed by the number of cases and by the amount of news out there, I think it can be relieving to know that there are people out there fighting for these things. And that's not just the lawyers. That's mostly the clients and the people that are willing to stand up for their own rights, to put themselves in the line of fire in a culture war. That takes a lot of courage. And I think it is good to know that there are people standing up for their own rights out there.
can I just add, if you're interested in press freedom, you should read this 41-page decision that the Trump judge issued with the restraining order for AP, because it is a smackdown against viewpoint discrimination and a nice history of First Amendment regarding press freedom issues. There are a variety of litigation trackers. So if you're interested in some of the court cases, because somebody decided like we need something to pull all these things together. So I know that Just Security has a great litigation tracker. And if you just Google Trump litigation tracker, you're going to find a lot of those popping up because there are so many cases currently pending. But as Adam said, the justice system works slower than the Sharpie pen does in the Oval Office. So, stay tuned.
Yeah.
I will also flag the National LGBTQ Bar has a litigation tracker of cases specifically involving everything having to do with sexual orientation and gender identity. So the Just Security tracker is very comprehensive, but because of the sheer volume, sometimes it's nice to get the topical digest of those challenges. And one thing I'll add, what Hadar said about the justice system working slowly, in some ways, I think that may be a good thing, because if I can have a kernel of hope that the Trump administration is going to end at some point in the future, I have more hope in lower courts, such as the court that vindicated the rights of the Associated Press, than I do in the Supreme Court right now. And so there is so much action in these lower courts going on. Not all these cases will reach the Supreme Court at all, and it will take a while for them to do so. So there can be a lot of sand in the gears of the Trump administration in these lower courts, even if a case ultimately ends up before the Supreme Court and has a result that I'm less happy with.
Can I also just say though, like as quickly and as wide as all of these executive orders are, it is not like the first Trump administration. Lawyers and organizations and NGOs and civil society and unions and everyone who's weighing in have weighed in really fast, been prepared, and have hit the ground running in terms of litigation strategies. And I have to just kind of flag that, because as much as it may be going slowly, the fact that there are as many lawsuits as there are executive orders, if not more, is in the first 80 days, because it takes a long time to actually work up a case, as Adam can tell you, is sort of a real testament to the preparation people have made and the sleepless nights that they pulled all-nighters to get these briefs ready, to be able to file them, and to really vigilantly try to defend the rights of every person. So I have great appreciation, and that's also why the administration is attacking lawyers and judges and the rule of law generally.
Yeah, I agree. I agree, Hadar. I think I've been impressed by not only the speed at which the lawsuits have been happening, but the outspokenness of the general population, right? Just this past weekend, we saw a lot of people protesting and the hands-off actions all over the country. And I think it's encouraging to see people attempting to fight back in whatever way is accessible to them. And so on that note, we're getting to the tail end of our conversation today. And, it's been a little bit doom and gloom here, but I want to, I wonder if any of you could offer any sort of advice for folks who are feeling like disillusioned, but also like, I want to do something, or maybe they have been somebody who's directly impacted by one of these executive orders in some way, shape, or form. Do you have thoughts or advice for folks who want to engage in some way, but maybe aren't sure how? And Adam, I'll ask you to start us off.
Sure. I think the the first thing that you can do is to understand your rights and learn about your rights, because a lot of people sort of have a high level of understanding of what their rights might be. But if you have a more granular understanding of your rights, then you will um, be more likely to recognize when your rights are being risked or violated. And if you can recognize when that happens, it's easier to stand up for them or to stand up for other people's rights. And I think that uh, if you are someone who is impacted by an executive order, or if your rights are threatened, ask for help. Because even if an organization, whether or not that's FIRE or the ACLU or anyone else, says, no, we can't represent you in court, it's better for us to be able to say, we can't help you today, but we might be able to help you tomorrow, or here's someone who can help you now. But the more people that contact organizations, the more likely we are to be able to find someone who can be that next Mary Beth Tinker, who can really demonstrate to the country or to just a single judge that these rights are important. So, learning your rights and standing up for your rights are the first two steps to being able to protect them.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Hadar.
I'm going to push back a little bit. And I think that some people are standing up and some people are kind of fighting back in whatever ways they can. It's scary to bring a case. It's scary to be a plaintiff. It's scary to stand up in an environment which is quickly constructed to try to chill dissent, chill speech, and scare people on the basis of their opinions and political views and identity. And I want to acknowledge that, and I want to empower people, because part of the way that, I'm going to say the word, autocrats and authoritarian governments come into power, and that's what we're seeing here, is a trend towards a highly centralized executive with enormous power, is because people let it happen. And it happens quickly. This is what happened in Hungary. And it happens because people don't quite understand what's happening and they think it's not really going to happen here. We are not as exceptional in the United States as we like to think that we are. And the last 80 days is showing us that. So when I talk to people about what they can do, I try to both encourage them to know that, you know what, protecting rights is hard, and it isn't around clicks and it isn't around signs and protests only. It is around educating yourself on your rights, but also around what are the things that are happening that maybe aren't on the front page, that we're not seeing every day. Those are the things that scare the hell out of me, is the things that we're not looking at, that we know are happening, but that we're not necessarily seeing yet. And to understand what our roles are as individuals and as representatives. We are each multipliers. We have a sphere of influence in our families, in our communities, in the people we know in other states. Whether you live in a blue state or a red state, you can talk to other people and help to build community, to be able to stand together at moments that are going to become even tougher than the ones we're in right now. And so I think taking responsibility as an individual, whether you have been affected yet or not, and I would contend that we all are, but we haven't seen it quite yet or felt it yet, and really coming together to strengthen each other's resolve in a time that's being constructed to be quite scary. And to chill that speech and chill dissent. And know that there are organizations like PEN America and FIRE and the ACLU and Woodhull and academics who we love, and others who will help and support and do everything that we can to ensure that we are protecting the rights that we deserve as human beings, and protecting the rights that have been well established through the almost 250 years of this country and through the Constitution and through the long history of free speech, litigation, court decisions, precedents, and more.
I appreciate the pushback, Hadar, and the empowerment. We all need it, particularly those of us at the organizations, right, to support one another. And Dara, I'd love to hear from you before we wrap things up for today.
Great. So I'm going to go granular with really specific things for people to do. So the obvious one is put your representatives in your phone and call at least one of them every day. They need to hear from their constituents to know that you're concerned about these issues, to have the backbone to fight for them. Or if you have representatives who do not agree with your point of view, they should know that their voters are angry at them. So then second, I think it's a great and important idea to kind of go small, to build community where you are. So go to a school board meeting, go to a township council meeting. Think of the smallest level of local government that has public meetings, and there will always be a public comment period. You can look up the agenda, you can look up any rules, how long you have to speak. You can plan what you're going to say, type something up, bring notes up with you. You can bring a friend or a family member so you're not the only one speaking on that issue. But get up and say, I'm concerned about this executive order. I'm concerned about this treatment of trans and non-binary people. What are we doing to protect them in our town, in our school district? I'm concerned about my speech rights. How can we protect them? This is the level where you can really have a direct impact. And it's important for representatives at this small level to know that people in the community are watching them and are asking for this. And then the last suggestion I'll make is these executive agencies take a lot of actions that affect us in our daily lives. When they are creating policies that kind of have more sticking power, they generally have to go through what's known as a notice and comment rulemaking period, and they take comments from the public. And they don't have to agree with those comments. It's unlikely that an agency is going to change what it's doing because of the comments, but they do have to respond to them. So they have to hold this period open, collect the comments, and then issue a final rule that acknowledges and responds to the comments. So every single comment, and you can generally do this online, is another grain of sand in the gears that they will have to respond to. And agency actions have been struck down in the past for not responding to comments. So you can sign up for email newsletters that will alert you to specific areas. You can set a news alert for notice and comment. And you don't have to be an expert. You just have to be a person who has an opinion and will share that online. And just do that whenever you have an opportunity to. Make your voice heard at levels where you can really make a little bit of an impact.
That's great.
I really appreciate that. And I think you all just wrapped us up so beautifully because you gave us a nice little system about how we're all going to continue to fight back. Adam told us to learn our rights. We're going to know them. Hadar, you encouraged us to empower ourselves, get in touch with our communities. And Dara, I really appreciate those 3 very concrete examples of easy things people can do. And I just have to say, in this social media-ified world we're living in, I know everybody's got an opinion, okay? Because it's in the Facebook comments, it's on Instagram. So just take that and put it into a comments section somewhere else. I think that's really helpful information. I want to say thank you to all of you for joining us today. I know, audience members, some of this stuff is hard to hear, and it can bring up some anxiety and some nervousness and some fear. But, I think if anything, panels like this have also shown us that we've got people that are doing this work. They might not be on the front page of the New York Times, but they're out there doing the work and here to support all of you. And I will drop links to all of their organizations in the chat and in the follow-up email. I hope you will continue to engage with them. So thanks everybody for being here. I will be here again next month for the censorship series. I hope to see you all there. And, you know, in the meantime, I'm going to go call my senator, I think.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.